Data Science Rabbit podcast with Michael Bagelman.
Welcome, dear listeners, to the darkest corners of academia, where in dusty library basements and dimly lit laboratories, researchers dare to probe the terrifying mathematics of the undead. You might think I jest, but gather round as I share with you the blood-curdling truth about the peer-reviewed papers that haunt the halls of science. In the shadows of scholarly journals lurk numerous academic papers about zombies. Yes, you heard correctly. Legitimate, published research about The Walking Dead. For you see, even the most serious-minded professors must sometimes dance with the dark side, using the spectre of zombie outbreaks to illuminate the macabre mathematics of predator-prey relationships and the spine-chilling spread of disease. In the cursed year of 2015, physical review unleashed upon the world, You Can Run, You Can Hide, the epidemiology and statistical mechanics of zombies, by Alemi and his fellow dark practitioners of mathematics. Their forbidden tome speaks of stochastic models and simulations vast enough to make your head spin, revealing how the tiniest change in initial conditions could spell doom for humanity. Let me share with you a terrible secret from epidemiology, the SIR model. Like a cursed incantation, these letters stand for susceptible, infected, and recovered. The dark mathematics behind this model is governed by differential equations that bind these variables together in an unholy alliance. Picture, if you dare, how new infections spread like a creeping fog. The more infected souls there are, the faster the curse spreads. But behold, as the pool of susceptible victims begins to dwindle, the rate of infection slows, for the infected begin to encounter each other more often than fresh prey. But in their dark calculations, these researchers twisted this model into something far more sinister. The SZR model: susceptible, zombie, and removed. For as we all know, dear listeners, there is no recovery from the zombie's curse, only removal. From the haunted halls of academia emerged another chilling manuscript, modelling our survival in a zombie apocalypse by de Mondonca and their cabal of researchers. This grimoire explores humanity's last line of defense: military intervention and civilian preparation. Their mathematical prophecies speak of meetings between the living and the dead, each encounter a deadly dance of probabilities. Listen closely as I reveal their dark calculations. When human and zombie paths cross in the dead of night, three fates await: death, zombification, or the slaying of the undead, each with its own probability. These chances shift like shadows, depending on whether the human is a mere civilian or a trained soldier. And when military personnel encounter civilians, there exists a small, precious chance of training them in the arts of survival, transforming them into fellow warriors against the darkness. The researchers discovered a terrifying threshold, a phase transition, if you will, where the fate of humanity balances on the edge of a knife. Cross this threshold with too few military personnel and, well, I dare not speak of such horrors, but wait. There is hope in their dark findings. The resistant humans scenario whispers of salvation through preparation. Rather than relying solely on military might, the salvation of humanity may lie in the strength and skills of common folk. The manuscript concludes with guidance for the living. Prioritize physical training and perhaps even the ancient arts of combat, for well-prepared civilians may be our only hope in both fictional and real-world apocalypses. In 2016, another terrifying tome emerged from the Journal of Microbiology and Biology Education, Equations of the End, teaching mathematical modeling using the zombie apocalypse by Lofgren's Coven. They speak of equilibrium points and tipping points, creating educational tools that dare to model our doom with mathematical precision. Their digital grimoire introduces an even more complex model, the SVE-ZR framework, accounting for the susceptible, vaccinated, exposed, zombie, and removed. The British Medical Journal itself was not immune to the undead plague. In 2015, Professor Tara Smith penned a chilling treatise on zombie infections, epidemiology, treatment, and prevention. She dared to classify these infections within public health frameworks, documenting their transmission like a medieval plague doctor cataloguing the symptoms of the Black Death. The manuscript even ventures into forbidden territory, contemplating the use of zombie pathogens as bioweapons. Though surely this would violate the dreaded Transylvania Convention. Deep in the catacombs of Texas A&M, John Marie Linhart, who later fled to Central Washington University, conjured mathematical modeling of a zombie outbreak. Her arcane calculations employed two different mathematical approaches to model humanity's doom. First came the Lotka-Volterra differential equations of predator-prey dynamics, where humans multiply naturally but fall prey to zombie encounters, while zombies increase by converting humans at rate alpha and decay naturally. But because humans can fight back against their undead pursuers, she discovered that epidemiological models better captured our terrible fate. Her equations revealed two possible endings to our tale. Either humans vanquish all zombies, or zombies consume all humans. Most terrifying of all, the zombie victory scenario proved stable under far more conditions than humanity's survival. Finally, Witkowski and their fellow researchers peered into the void with Bayesian analysis of epidemics, zombies, influenza, and other diseases, using dark arts known as Bayesian inference and Markov chain Monte Carlo methods. They drew parallel doom between fictional zombie plagues and real-world epidemics. Their findings whisper a warning. Early intervention is crucial to prevent the total collapse of susceptible populations. But, dear listeners, this is merely scratching the surface of academia's obsession with the undead. There are more papers lurking in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. For now, I'll hand you over to the Google Notebook LM Deep Dive team, if they're still alive.
Okay, get ready to dive into something a little different this time. We're tackling zombies.
You know, the undead and all that comes with them.
You sent us a whole bunch of stuff about modeling zombie outbreaks, articles, research papers, even a student project.
Wow.
It seems like you're really interested in the the science behind those movies.
I have to say, it is pretty fascinating. It's not just about the blood and gore. You can actually learn something from this stuff.
Right, like how these fictional outbreaks can teach us about real-world systems.
Exactly. It's all about complex systems thinking, which is a fancy way of saying how do things spread and interact?
Right.
And what better way to study that than with zombies, right?
I mean, it's a fun way to think about some pretty serious stuff. And speaking of serious, I was impressed by the level of detail in these sources. You've got researchers using actual epidemiological models like the SR model to study how these outbreaks could play out.
Right, the SAR model. It's a classic.
But instead of tracking the flu, they're analyzing the undead. It's wild.
It makes sense, though, when you think about it. The SAR model breaks a population down into groups: susceptible, infected, and recovered. And it looks at how people move between those groups.
And how the disease spreads.
Exactly. But with the zombies, there's a bit of a twist. They don't exactly recover, do they? So researchers have had to adapt the model.
It's like they're creating a playbook for the apocalypse. One paper even used the movie Shaun of the Dead to estimate the initial susceptible population.
Talk about dedication.
Seriously.
Yeah.
But it just goes to show how adaptable these models can be.
Absolutely. And by changing some of the parameters, they can analyze all sorts of scenarios, even fictional ones. And one of the first things you have to figure out is, what kind of zombie are we dealing with?
Yeah, because a slow-moving Romero-style zombie is going to spread much differently than those fast, infected types you see in movies like 28 Days Later.
Huge difference. And your sources really dig into this, showing how the speed and even the behavior of the zombies totally changes how things play out.
Which brings up something I found fascinating, the concept of a critical bite radius. What is that exactly?
It's pretty much what it sounds like. How close does a zombie have to get to infect you? And that can vary depending on the type of zombie we're talking about.
Okay, so a slow zombie might have a smaller radius because it's easier to, keep your distance.
Exactly. While a fast zombie, you might just get a little too close.
And boom, you're infected.
Exactly. The models use this bite radius along with things like zombie speed and human evasiveness to see how quickly an infection would spread.
So if you're in a crowded city, things could go downhill fast.
Very fast. It's a recipe for disaster. And it's not just about how the zombies move and infect. The way humans react plays a huge role too.
So it's not just about outrunning the horde, but understanding the mechanics behind it all.
Exactly. You've got to be smart about it.
You've really piqued my curiosity. How did these models capture that element of human chaos and decision-making?
Oh, it gets really interesting.
So how do you even begin to model human behavior in the middle of a zombie apocalypse?
Yeah.
It seems incredibly chaotic.
That's what makes these models so interesting. They have to find ways to incorporate that human element, and it gets pretty complex.
Complex how?
We're talking differential equations, random walks, even something called cellular automata.
Cellular automata.
Yeah, it sounds complicated, but
That's investigated.
it's actually pretty cool. Imagine a grid where each square represents something, a person, a zombie, or even just an empty space.
Okay.
Cellular automata use a set of rules to determine how the state of each square changes based on its neighbors.
So like if a healthy person is next to a zombie, they might become infected.
Exactly. It's kind of like a very intense game of digital tag.
I like that analogy.
And by tweaking those rules, researchers can simulate different scenarios and see how the outbreak spreads. You also mentioned diffusion models earlier. Those are important too.
Right. One of the papers used a diffusion model to show how zombies spread, but I'll admit I'm still a little fuzzy on how that works.
It's a bit simpler than cellular automata, but it gives you a good visual. Imagine zombies spreading out like a gas or a liquid, slowly diffusing outwards from a central point.
Okay, I can picture that.
It helps to illustrate how things like population density or even the speed of the zombies can affect the overall spread of the outbreak.
So if you're in a densely populated area,
You better start running.
makes sense. And speaking of running, is it better to hole up somewhere safe or just try to outrun the horde?
That's where those individual-based models come in.
Right, where each person is like their own little agent in the simulation.
Exactly. And they can test out different survival strategies. And in many cases, running is a good bet.
Especially if they're those slow-moving Romero zombies.
Right. It's all about putting distance between you and the horde, at least initially. One paper even pointed out that trying to slow down a large horde might not be the best use of your resources.
Like trying to hold back a flood with a bunch of sandbags.
Exactly. Eventually, you're going to get overwhelmed. But running, that buys you time.
Okay, so running buys you time. But then what? These models must factor in things like finding food, water, shelter, all that stuff you need to survive long term.
Absolutely. And that's where the real strategic thinking comes in.
So we've talked about outrunning the horde, understanding the mechanics of the outbreak, even factoring in things like resources.
Right. It's like a whole zombie survival strategy guide.
It is.
Yeah.
But it's not just about individual survival, right? There's something to be said for banding together, fighting back as a group.
Absolutely. Your sources definitely highlight that. A well-organized resistance can make a huge difference.
Really, even against, a relentless enemy like zombies.
Especially against zombies. Think about it. If you're on your own, you have to do everything yourself. Finding food, water, shelter, watching your back constantly.
Exhausting.
Right. But if you're part of a group, you can divide those tasks, share resources, protect each other. The models show that cooperation like that can dramatically increase your chances of survival.
There's power in numbers, even when facing down the undead. But what about containment? It can't just be about running and hiding forever.
You're right. Eventually, you've got to face the music. Or, well, the zombies. And your sources talk about how researchers use something called boundary conditions in these models to explore containment strategies.
Boundary conditions. Okay, I vaguely remember that from earlier. Remind me what that means again.
Sure. Basically, it's a way to define the limits of the simulated environment. Like, what happens when a zombie reaches the edge of the map? There are two main types: absorbing boundaries and reflective boundaries.
Okay, so absorbing boundaries, those are like
Imagine a zombie walking off a cliff. They're just gone, removed from the simulation.
out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. It could represent things like zombies wandering into a vast, unpopulated area, or just being eliminated from the equation entirely.
Makes sense. And reflective boundaries, those are more like...
Imagine running into a wall, you hit it, and you bounce back.
So the zombies are contained within a smaller area.
Precisely. It could represent natural barriers like mountains or rivers, or even man-made defenses like walls or fences.
Okay, so absorbing boundaries are like zombies leaving the game board, while reflective ones keep them in play but contained.
A perfect way to put it. And the type of boundary used can really change how the simulation plays out.
So we've gone from basic SCR models to simulating complex human behavior all through the lens of a zombie apocalypse. It's amazing how much you can learn from something that, isn't even real.
That's the beauty of modeling, right? It lets us simplify complex systems and study them in a controlled way. And those insights, they can apply to all sorts of things, from predicting the spread of diseases to, yes, even understanding how a zombie outbreak might play out.
It's like holding up a mirror to the real world, but with a slightly more undead twist.
Exactly. And it reminds us that knowledge is power. The more we understand how things work, the better prepared we are to face whatever challenges come our way.
Even if those challenges involve hordes of the undead. This deep dive has definitely given me a whole new perspective on those zombie movies, and maybe even on the world around us.
I'm glad to hear that.
It really makes you think about what other factors might come into play during a zombie outbreak. Like, how would different terrains, mountains, deserts, dense forests affect both zombie movement and human survival? It's something to ponder, right?
Definitely.
Maybe it'll even inspire your next deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this thrilling journey into the world of zombie models. Until next time, stay curious.
This has been the Data Science Rabbit Podcast, hosted by Michael Bagelman. Find the Data Science Rabbit Podcast on all your favorite social media, including YouTube and TikTok. Follow Michael on LinkedIn or visit datasciencerabbithole.com.